I'm Fanny Gay, and I'm the program coordinator at the Maison Française at Columbia University. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce our speakers today as Lucienne Peiry, who has kindly agreed to join us, comes from my native city, Lausanne in Switzerland. Lucienne Peiry will talk about self-taught outsider artists who use their own bodies as a medium of expression in the isolation and exclusion of psychiatric hospitals. She will then be joined by Camille Robcis for a rich dialogue, I think. And we will reserve some time towards the end of the hour for a few questions from the audience. So feel free to pose a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, in English or in French, at any time during the conversation. I would like to thank our two speakers, as well as our co-sponsors, the Department of History and the Society and Fellows and Heman Center for the Humanities. Let me introduce Lucienne Peiry. She obtained a PhD in the history of art in Lausanne. Her dissertation was the first to be devoted to art brut, a term that I guess she will define in her presentation today, and to the history of the collection that Jean Dubuffet instigated. It was initially published by Flammarion as L'Art Brut in 1997 and has been reedited and translated many times. In 2001, she took over the direction of Lausanne Collection de l'Art Brut from Michel Thévaux. She discovered several outsider art creators in Switzerland and in various other countries in Europe, as well as in India, Japan, China, Benin, and Bali. Since 2011, she's a lecturer at the EPFL, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, and she's also the curator of several exhibitions in Europe and Japan, especially Intextricabilia, enchevêtrement magique, à la Maison Rouge à Paris, and in 2021, Écrits d'Art Brut at the Tingley Museum in Basel, an exhibition based on her last book, Écrits d'Art Brut, Graphoman extravagant, a book that I will share the link in the chat box in a few minutes. Camille Robcis is Associate Professor of History and French at Columbia University. In 2020-2021, she's also a Heman Center Fellow. And her second book, Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, has a chapter devoted to the history of institutional psychotherapy and the Hospital of Saint-Alban that is linked to the very beginning of Art Brut. The book is forthcoming in 2021 with the University of Chicago Press, and I will also include a link to this book in the chat box. And so I'm very happy to have Lucienne and Camille joining us today for this transatlantic conversation about outside art, or art brut, if you prefer. Lucienne, c'est avec joie que je vous passe la parole maintenant.
Thank you very much. Merci, Fanny. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good evening. It depends if you are in New York, in Paris, or in Lausanne. Me too. I'm really delighted to be here with you. It's a great pleasure for me. And I would like first to thank the Maison Française at Columbia University, and particularly Shani Peer and Fanny Gay, who have invited me to give this conference and to share this moment with Camille Robcis and with you. Even if I imagine most of you are familiar with Art Brut, I would like to give a brief, very brief definition in order to understand and to get the feel of these strange artworks we will discover and study today or tonight. So the French painter Jean Dubuffet invents the term art brut in 1945, just after the Second World War, and we can translate it more or less by outsider art. But as it is a fixed designation formulated by Dubuffet, I will use this term in my talk. So art brut brings together works of non-conformist people, patients from psychiatric hospitals, prisoners, mediums, psychics, loners, as well as eccentrics and outcasts. So we can say they haven't had the right to speak, and they seize this right by diving into creation in total freedom and in a self-taught way. So they have received no artistic training. They ignore artistic norms, rules, and know-how. So they create productions of incredible inventiveness and insolence concerning iconography, style, techniques, and the use of space, for example. And the notion of ignorance, usually, this notion is always by definition considered in a negative way. To ignore means to not know. The ignorance tells the gap, the flaw, and the term has constantly a negative connotation. On the contrary, in Arbrut's point of view, the outsider art's perspective, ignorance is an opportunity, because it not only helps, but forces people to imagine and especially to invent the subjects, the techniques, the way to represent, to draw, to paint. Consequently, they discover by themselves their own artistic capacity and they develop them. There are, in my view, three key points, key words concerning art brut: solitude, secrecy, and silence. Very easy to remember them. Each begins with S: solitude, secrecy, and silence. Each creator works in solitude, secrecy, and silence without talking to anybody about his or her creation. These artists works in anonymity as if feeling the pages of a diary. The addressee of the work is most of the time absent from the artist's mind. In the same way, the creators do not expect any social recognition and approval. They do not need them at all, because they are unaware that they are proceeding in the field of creation. We are far away from the artistic scene. Now I would like to introduce you to an outstanding creator. Maybe you know him. His name is Arthur Bispo do Rosario, Arthur Bispo do Rosario, and he is Brazilian. His story is disturbing and his body of work is considerable. Bispo do Rosario is a descendant of Black slaves born in the northeast of Brazil, a poor region of the country. And from 1925, when he is 14 years old, he serves in the military navy. He is a sailor for 9 years, but he is dismissed for insubordination and indiscipline. He also takes up a career as a boxer for a few years and has several small jobs, such as hotel porter and domestic helper. His life turns upside down one day in December 1938. He is a young man, 27 years old, and he has a revelation, an epiphany. He suffers a psychiatric crisis during which Christ appears to him, he says, escorted by 7 angels in a blue halo. Shortly afterwards, he has new visions that reveal him his mission, that is, of creating the universe, recreating the universe, so that he could obtain redemption during his passage to the afterlife. He is diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, and in 1939, he is interned in a large psychiatric institution in the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, where he lives for 50 years until his death. Bispo de Rosario refuses all medication, drug treatments, and therapy, and prefers to work behind closed doors in solitude. By the way, he transforms his cell into a space to create and conserve his works. While listening to a voice guiding him, he frequently practices fasting and sexual abstinence, creating nearly 1,000 artworks that he refuses to part with. Bispo says they are vital to him. Bispo's goal is therefore to do an inventory of objects from the urban and industrialized world in order to present them to the creator when he appears before him after his death. In order to accomplish his mission, he gathers a never-ending number of discarded objects and materials, worn out or thrown in the garbage and accumulated furiously. Here you can see the flagship work of all his production, the ample and solemn gown or toga called manto de apresentação, mantle of presentation. It is charged with a symbolic and sacred dimension. This garment is a synthesis of the iconographic subjects of his whole production. Look carefully, and you can see buildings and ships, musical instruments, vehicle, furniture, games and toys, as well as signs, words and numbers, all embroidered in color. This cape is made from a used hospital blanket, which is reinvented. As you can see, it is also adorned with an abundance of multicolored threads and sewn cords, twisted and entwined, that run from top to bottom of the garment. With great skill, the embroiderer uses different stitches on the whole set. It is important to keep in mind that the materials that Bispo recovers and uses, totally transforming them, all come from the psychiatric hospital, including garbage. So they belong to the life of exclusion, internment, and deprivation. Through his work, he transforms these materials into inventiveness, and as the artist Louise Bourgeois said, into mystery, beauty, and freedom. I would like to draw your attention to an important aspect. Inside the garment, as you can see, like a confidential message, the designer writes feminine names and surnames. I think we can consider these women are the women who would take care of him during his appearance. I read Celia Luisa, Elena Lopez, Josefa Eugenia, among the others. And these names and surnames appear like a feminine procession in my view, as they are sewn on the reverse side, as you can see. The words are subtly concealed, and the writing secretly comes into contact with the body and is essentially close to the skin. Bispo de Rosario occasionally puts on this gown, which he wants to keep close to him in order to be ready for the special day. He would then be like the mythological figure Atlas, who carries the word on his shoulders. So the image and the writing on the ornament confer a metaphysical dimension to the garment of passage that will open to him the door of the afterlife. As we've seen, Bispo wears his ornament only a few times and reserves it for this exceptional day. On the contrary, the German creator Agnes Richter doesn't create clothes to dream about. She needs the carnal sensation every day. And so she wears her jacket on her skin, feeling it physically, as if the first skin is not enough or no longer sufficient, as if she has become too fragile and vulnerable, as if the second skin becomes necessary for her survival in a strategy of self-defense and protection. Agnes Richter was born in East Germany in the middle of the 19th century. First, she works as a maid in Dresden. Then, as a young woman, she emigrates to the US. After a few years, she returns to her native country and is hired as a seamstress. She remains single. Deeply distressed, she is interned at the age of 49, and 2 years later, she creates this major artwork. Agnes Richter's creation strikes at once by the ingenuity that she deploys to appropriate and totally transform the jacket of the uniform imposed on all the patients of the German psychiatric hospital. So the former seamstress hijacks the items of clothing and makes it her own by inverting the back and the front and swapping the right and left sleeves. The jacket is thus doubly turned. She sews a few strips of brown woolen, as you can see, a woolen fabric that stands in contrast with the light gray linen of the institutional uniform. And then, probably to give a feminine look, she adjusts the waist and gives fullness and volume to the shoulders. Agnes Richter's inventiveness also unfolds thanks to the embroidered writing which flows on the jacket, covering it entirely. So we have to think about that. Many doctors have seen it as an horror vacui. It is a Latin locution that means, as you might know, fear of emptiness. But to me, the abundant creation rather evokes an amor impleti, I mean love of the full. That is to say, the imperious and irrepressible need to express oneself and to create on a rare and precious support in condition of confinement and exile. This particular ornament becomes a new canvas of expression, a sort of bodily diary. This woman seems to have worn it for more than 20 years until her death in 1918. That was the conclusion drawn from the traces of wear on the textile and the discoloration marks in the armpits caused by perspiration. An autobiographical resonance can be read in some of the writings deciphered on the jacket. The words that are sewn on the bust are relative to her own person. The inscriptions are inside and come into direct contact with the skin. They establish deep and intimate relationship. It is very difficult to decipher the writings embroidered on this jacket. Sometimes the line become tangled and break off. Perhaps Agnes Richter wants to dissuade the potential reader from accessing her private pages. These tricks may be used to encrypt the words, to keep them secret. In this way, Agnes Richter is able to wear her clandestine jacket in broad daylight, in full view of other patients and hospital staff, without anyone being able to access it, without revealing its meaning. Look at this picture. Along the white, black, blue, yellow, pink lines, an inscription stands out from the text. The number 583 appears in red several times. According to Agnes Richter, Agnes Richter's medical file, it corresponds to her own number at the hospital. She has sewn it on her jacket in order to avoid it getting lost in the laundry. But I think this number to which her person is reduced in such a humiliating way can also be interpreted as a denunciation, as a silent protest against the stigmatization of which she is a victim. Agnes Richter denounces the dehumanizing nature of the psychiatric hospital, integrating it several times into the artistic work. No doubt, the embroidered writing, knotted and laced on the linen, brings strength to the piece of clothing. This allows her to stay alive. It helps to create a new free identity for herself. After having discovered the artworks made by two creators, let's now discover the creation of the Scottish Angus McPhee. His various garments are made from blades of grass. He views them by hand with surprising speed, making sweaters, pants, long socks, and shoes, often oversized, as simulacra of clothes. Angus McPhee, born in Scotland, is mobilized when the Second World War breaks out, leaving his family, the family farm, his land. The experience of war traumatizes him, and the first sign of schizophrenia appear 2 years later at the age of 25. He is interned near Inverness. At the time he is locked up, he falls into silence and doesn't utter a word. At the end of each day, McPhee retires alone at the back of the hospital's large park, and it is there that he begins to create some singular works. Sweater, pants, and socks are made and then hung up by him from the branches of tree and presented on the ground, like in ephemeral and daily performances, in the open air and out of sight. The larger than life clothes, which seem made for legendary characters, give a dreamlike connotation to these organic ornaments. For Angus McPhee, these clothes appear as ghostly bodies, extensions of his body assigned to exile, extensions of his being. And When he leaves the hospital after 50 years of internment, and when he returned to live with his sister in his native village, he regains his speech. He speaks again after 50 years of silence. Look at this dress. This is a dress, but before we look at this artwork, I would, first of all, like to evoke the conditions in which it was made. Marguerite Sirvins enters the hospital of Saint-Alban in the south of France in 1932. She is 42 years old. The first years of her internment imposed extremely harsh daily living conditions on her. The hospital is an old fortress with no heating or electricity, no bathroom or toilets. She suffers from the cold and lack of hygiene. Marguerite Sirvins often falls ill, pneumonia, bronchitis, angina. She suffers from an affection of one eye that is not treated, and she loses her sight in one eye. It means her body is weakened, rarely washed and cared for. Her body is humiliated. At the beginning of her stay in this hospital, don't forget, it has been covered for years with the uniform of a psychiatric patient that erases all individuality. And it is precisely for this bruised body that she intends her major creation. She is preparing a wedding dress for it. Marguerite Sirvins dreams of love. She dreams of her wedding, but all her dreams are impossible. So she creates her own wedding dress with the threads of her bed sheets. She unravels her sheets and those of her nightmare companions, stitch after stitch. Using only needles, Marguerite Sirvins works her piece with a rare refinement. Look at this picture. You can see how she alternates transparencies and opacity and creates a kind of lace made of tight and loose stitches. And look, between the two breasts, some pale pink threads form a small rosebud, but for the wedding day dream. All delicacy and sensuality. This garment is imaginary. Marguerite Sirvins will never wear her dress, which is not suitable for her corpulent body. The idea is quite different. It goes beyond and it even transcends the appalling situation in which she is locked up, and she finds a symbolic alternative that functions as a deliverance, a moment of extreme freedom. It seems that the woman takes about 5 years to realize this work. She would have finished it a few weeks before her death. And I can't help thinking that this dress constitutes a kind of shroud, I mean a textile piece intended for the body to envelop it, accompany it in death. So Marguerite Sirvins, Agnes Richter, Angus McPhee, and Arthur Bispo de Rosario make clothes that they feel invested with salvaging virtues. These garments, as we've seen, protect them from adversity and from external threats. At the same time, they allow them to decorate, to honor, and to exalt their bodies. they draw strengths from these adornments. By their act of creation, these artists poetically affirm a way of being in the world, alive. Thank you for your attention.
So should I just start, Fanny? I guess so, right? Let me see, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Is this working? Lucienne, is this working? Can you see it? Yeah, okay,
Perfect,
great.
yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Lucienne, for this fascinating presentation and for the beautiful images that you showed us. Since Lucienne mentioned the hospital of Saint-Alban, where Marguerite Sirvins was committed prior to the war, I wanted to say a few words about the movement of radical psychiatry known as institutional psychotherapy, which was born in Saint-Alban during the Second World War, and which was in constant dialogue with Brut. So as Fanny said at the beginning, what I'm going to talk about today very briefly comes from my book, Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France, which is coming out in April in just a few months. And I originally wanted to devote an entire chapter to the relationship between institutional psychotherapy and Art Brut, but I never got around to it. So I'm extremely happy to be able to have this conversation today and with Lucienne and to learn from her, because I'm not an art historian, so I come to this very much as from a kind of amateur perspective. So as Lucienne explained, the term Art Brut was invented by Jean Dubuffet, who was not only an artist, but also a collector. And Lucienne, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we owe him the most important association of Art Brut, which was first called La Compagnie de l'Art Brut, that was first held in Paris at the Galerie René Drouin, then here in New York City in 1951, back in Paris in 1962, and finally in Lausanne since 1975, where it still lives today. Dubuffet, in fact, traveled to Saint-Alban in the late 1940s as part of his tour of psychiatric hospitals to search for new art forms that were produced outside of the professional art world. This is where you get the English term outsider art, right? So it's outside of the kind of conventions of the art world. Dubuffet had long shared the surrealist fascination with madness, but he became especially aware of the specificity of the hospital setting after paying regular visits to his friend, the poet and playwright Antonin Artaud, who spent the last years of his life in the psychiatric hospital of Rodez. It's in this context that Dubuffet traveled to several clinics in Switzerland to meet psychiatrists, patients, and to acquire new works for his growing collection. That's how he arrived to Saint-Alban, where he was especially interested in the work of Auguste Forestier, a local farmer who was committed at the age of 27. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic and who stayed at Saint-Alban until he died in 1958. So these are some of the examples of the works of Forestier. And here you see Tosquelles, who I'll tell you about in a second, holding Forestier's boat. Dubuffet was eventually able to acquire a few pieces by Forestier that are still exhibited in Lausanne. Forestier was also an important figure for two of the most famous practitioners of institutional psychotherapy, François Tosquelles and Jean Houry, who commented directly on Forestier's work in their writings on psychosis. As Houry described it, Forestier would sit in the hallways of the hospital with his tools and work there. And he, according to Houry, he felt protected by the community, but his work was also a way to fight against what he called disintegration or l'émiettement, against the permanent destruction and an attempt to kind of reconstruct the world permanently. These are Houry's words, but I think they come very close to what Lucienne was talking about in terms of kind of artistic creation as a way to fight against disintegration. And so Houry, who has written several books, many on psychosis and on institutional psychotherapy, you'll notice here that he also wrote directly on art, right? on schizophrenia and art and kind of aesthetic art. And Tosquelles also kind of left an important, or wrote many important books on art directly. So very quickly, who were these doctors at Saint-Alban, and what did they do to fight against the solitude, secrecy, and silence, the three S's that Lucienne mentioned that kind of haunted psychiatric hospitals at this time? I think the best way to understand institutional psychotherapy is to place it in its context. In the small and isolated village of Saint-Alban in central France, where this one hospital that you see here gathered a group of doctors, of political activists, of artists, and of course of patients, all of whom were trying to survive World War II. So they were trying to survive, first of all, the German occupation, but also the German occupation, which had brought chronic shortage of food, of medicine, of heat. Lucienne already mentioned the kind of deplorable conditions of psychiatric hospitals in general prior to the war, but all of these was accentuated by the war. But psychiatric hospitals in France also participated in what some historians have called a sort of a soft extermination of the cognitively disabled. This was very well known in the case of Germany, right? The Nazi regime openly promoted the euthanasia through its program T4, but the Vichy regime also kind of closed its eyes on the death of patients in psychiatric hospitals. So the doctors of Saint-Alban came from various social backgrounds, but they all shared a vision of psychiatry as a deeply political practice. Some of them had been involved in communist or anarchist politics prior to the war, and many of them had joined the resistance against the Germans. So this is, for example, François Tosquelles, who I mentioned, who's probably the kind of most important, the sort of founding father, if you'd like, of institutional psychotherapy, who was born in Catalonia and was very active in the POUM. You see a picture right here, kind of anarchist-inspired leftist group. And after fighting in the Spanish Civil War, Tosquelles ends up in a refugee camp in France and eventually makes his way to Saint-Alban. So here he is in Saint-Alban already as a doctor. Another example of this is Lucien Bonafe, who you see here, an important member of the French resistance. And I've already mentioned Jean Houry, who was a resident at Saint-Alban in 1947, and who in 1953, Houry goes on to found the Clinic of Laborde. You see the Castle of Laborde in this background here. The Castle of Laborde became especially well known in the 60s and 70s because it's where Félix Guattari worked for many years. And it was a major source of inspiration for the book that Guattari co-wrote with Gilles Deleuze in 1972, Anti-Oedipus. So I'll just mention three more figures who were all at Saint-Alban, who also played an important role in shaping institutional psychotherapy. The historian of science, Georges Canguilhem, who was in the resistance during the war and hid in the castle of Saint-Alban. And of course, his notions of the normal and the pathological were very important for the psychiatrists, but also he took a lot of these of inspiration in his own work from psychiatry. The surrealist poet Paul Éluard, whose book Souvenir the kind of memories of the House of the Mad was written while he was at Saint-Alban. And finally, Frantz Fanon, who was a resident right after the war, so he was a few years after, but he who had his medical internship at Saint-Alban, and who continued to turn to the methods of institutional psychotherapy in his psychiatric practice in Algeria and then in Tunisia. And of course, Fanon was also someone who had been thinking about the relationship between the political and the psychic in all of his work, right? His work prior to Saint-Alban, like Black Skin, White Masks, and after Saint-Alban, like Wretched of the Earth. The fundamental premise of institutional psychotherapy was that alienation was always social and psychic at once, right? And they played with this idea of the French term aliénation, which is madness, but it's also sort of social alienation, right? The war had made this especially clear. Fascism and collaboration required a particular state of mind. This is why Tosquelles referred to Marx and Freud as the two legs of institutional psychotherapy. And he said that basically when one leg walked, the other needed to follow. So the point was not to choose politics or psychoanalysis, but politics with psychoanalysis, Marx with Freud always. Freud, but also eventually Lacan, who became Jacques Lacan, whose work becomes extremely important, a kind of foundational reference for institutional psychotherapy. So the task of psychiatry was not just to heal the head, but to heal the environment. And the immediate environment here was the hospital. So the goal was to turn the hospital from the space of solitude, secrecy, and silence into what they called a healing collective. According to institutional psychotherapy, all groups, all institutions, all collective endeavors, all subjectivities also had the potential to become what they called concentrationist, basically authoritarian, oppressive, totalitarian. So the idea was that you could never end alienation once and for all, but what you could do was try to track these latent concentrationist tendencies by mobilizing individual and collective fantasies, desires, transferences, in other words, with the help of psychoanalysis. So let me give you just a few examples to kind of anchor this. The first thing that the doctors at Saint-Alban did was to tumble the walls around the hospital so that the patients could wander around freely. So the idea here was that psychiatry could be practiced anywhere and at all times. And this was something that Tosquelles was very committed to, because during the war, he had kind of set up psychiatric services in the concentration camp, at the army, right? Like you didn't need a hospital to practice psychiatry. You could be a psychiatrist at all times, right? They also removed the medical blouses so that doctors and staff were indistinguishable from the patients. And this had a kind of practical purpose, but also a theoretical idea, is that you wouldn't get too comfortable in your role as a doctor or as a nurse or as a sick patient. You would constantly be questioning your identity, right? Constantly be kind of questioning subjectivities, etc. In order to develop structures that would produce or institute this new healing collective, institutional psychotherapy set up what they called clubs. These were patient-run cooperatives. You can think of them almost like unions, that were in charge of organizing all the activities within the hospital. The club planned the meals, they planned theater and musical performances, sports, parties, field trips, all of the social activities that were deemed integral to the cure. They also ran the library, the different ergotherapy stations, and they published newsletters and journals. And it's in these ergotherapy stations that a lot of the art that will later be known as art brut was fabricated. So here are some examples of the kinds of events that Saint-Alban was doing. So this is a poster, for example, of a theater performance, of a concert. So this is from the 70s, but they were still committed to institutional psychotherapy. And these were all kind of activities deemed integral for the social. This is the journal that I was mentioning, and you see this is the editorial, so trait d'union hyphen, one editorial here by Tosquelles, the other by Fanon. You see, this was a very important device that Guattari wrote a lot about, called la grille, the grid. And you see here, everybody had your name on, so the doctors, the nurses, and the activities on the right. So you could cooking, pharmacy. And the idea was to rotate all the time, again, to kind of avoid getting too used to routines, right? So this is what I think very much related to the kinds of things that Lucienne was talking about, the kind of dehumanizing sense of the hospital, or the idea that uniforms would kind of oppress individuality. Here, the point was to actually build mechanisms that would prevent this from happening. The club, the journal, the activities of the hospital were all designed to facilitate the emergence of a collective horizontality, a new space of transference, what Tosquelles called a transferential constellation. To produce a collective was to produce its conditions of possibility, to work through the effects of transference, of counter-transference, resistances, and power with constant vigilance. And in this process, art played a key role. So that's a very brief introduction. I want to leave some time for questions, because I see that there's already several of them. Oh, let me stop sharing my screen. But just to get the conversation going, I thought I wanted to ask Lucienne about two questions that came to me after her talk. The first one was around the question of the body, which I thought was really fascinating, the role that the body plays in the pieces that you showed us. So one of Jean Houry's contentions, something that he took from Eugene Bleuler, but also from the psychiatrist Gisela Pankov, is that schizophrenia manifests itself as a kind of difficulty or trouble at the level of the body, right? That there's a kind of problem of incarnation, and that the drives, instead of being gathered, are kind of go all over the place. And so this is one of the reasons why they need things like a transferential constellation, or a different understanding of transference in treating psychosis, a collective transference. So, you know, and I'm not asking you this, I know that you're not a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst, so you can't answer if this works or not, but I'm wondering, the images of the clothes make me think that it's almost a kind of, that the clothes seem like a kind of way to contain the drives, right? To make the body more contained in some way, so molded. So I wanted to know if in your experience, or if in your studies of these clothes, if you could say a little bit more about how the artists experience their bodies, if you have any evidence of them talking about their experience of their bodies as this kind of dissociation, and the relationship with the clothes as a kind of mold, if you'd like, for the drives. And the second was about the role of language in the clothes, which was also really interesting, because another kind of central idea of institutional psychotherapy was that psychosis resulted from what Jean-Henri called like a hole or a lesion in the symbolic order, right? That there was, so words in psychosis never signified in the same way that they signified for people who are not considered mad, basically. You see this very clearly in your example, I think, of Bispo, who is talking to Christ directly, right? He has a direct conversation with Christ. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about kind of the role of the symbolic in the writings that you've examined, right? And whether you see the writing as an attempt to kind of make order, or as a different form of expression, or as a kind of way to rethink the role of the referent in this. So these are some questions. You know, you don't have to answer them right now, but we can start like this and then open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll take them right after.
Okay, for the first question, I would ask, just like that, of course, that actually these artworks contain them. Yes, we can say that all the mental, the dress, keep them calm, appease them, but at the same time, I think that all of them work furiously, with passion, they get excited. It's not only to be calm and to be protected, but they get excited, and they want to be excited, and they go ahead creating and inventing. And I think that they open the doors, and they are really closely linked with their phantasm. For the second question, I would ask, yes, I think that they want to organize not only their life, but they want to organize the world, their life, the world, and the universe. They want to organize and to frame the universe. As you said, Bispo de Rosario, it's very interesting on his mantle. We can see all the world is very well organized, but at the same time reorganizing this world and the cosmos, the whole cosmos. At the same time, he dropped the amours. We can say that he opens the doors of the fantasy and of his inventiveness, even his wildness. So I think that there are 2 points of view.
That's great, thank you. So we already have a few questions. Lucienne, maybe I can just ask you. One of them is whether you believe that there's artists who are working like this today. Sort of, what is the legacy of Brut today? Or
I think that no, they are not working in this in the psychiatric hospitals now. like it was the case for Bispo de Rosario or Marguerite Sirvins at Saint-Alban. Of course, everything has changed. You know perfectly that in the psychiatric hospitals nowadays, there are artistic workshops that are organized. This is wonderful for them, for the patients, for the staff, of course. But we have to keep in mind that these workshops are organized and the creation is organized. They are invited, all the patients are invited to create, to paint. They are invited to paint following a subject, using this pencil and using this and this. So it is wonderful once again, but it's absolutely contrary with Art Brut. Art Brut is wild and it flies away. Art Brut now, I think there are some exceptions, of course, in psychiatric hospitals, but now we have to look for Art Brut in other places. It was exactly what did Jean Dubuffet at the end during the 60s or 70s. He was aware that it wasn't possible anymore to discover wonderful pieces in such spaces. But you know, it's very difficult. Actually, it's very difficult to find Art Brut as the creators' works in anonymity, in solitude, secrecy, and silence. They don't want your recognition. They don't want to show you. So it is always thanks a person. It's a doctor, it's a neighbor, it's a mother, a father, a brother. I think it is an important figure. We can say that it is a guardian, and this is a third people, somebody who inform us. It is absolutely impossible to discover Art Brut alone by ourselves. All
Right.
of us have been able to discover artworks thanks to these people, and they are really, really very important for us.
That's great. Thank you. You have another question about Bispo. Like how should we feel about the fact that Bispo expressed the wish to be buried in his presentation mantle, but his wish was obviously denied to him by the hospital administrators who wished to save it for prosperity? And sort of related to that, another question asks why wasn't he buried in his mantle that he had created for his meeting with God?
Yes, of course. I understand. These are very interesting questions. Actually, yes, we can ask ourselves: is it right? It's a very delicate question. I think that it is really important, and first, and perhaps more important, to share and to show this garment, to show this symbolic garment, and to invite people, the public, the students, historians, sociologists, to think about, to study it, to inventory the artworks, and to share it. It is for the community, for the whole community. It is an artistic patrimony, and I think it's very important. But I share this very strange feeling, as it was his desire. But it is important to keep in mind, and I think that we have to trust people. We have to trust public, because I am sure that the public, the visitors, the spectators, the readers are able to understand and to be respectful towards these very strange, delicate, and fragile artworks.
Mm-hmm. Good. So that there's a double question, one for you and one for me, in French, but I'll translate it in English. One of them is whether there is an equivalent movement of institutional psychotherapy in the US, basically whether the US has institutional psychotherapy. And to you, it's how can you explain your interests for these people? Sort of how did you get to this topic of Albrecht? So do you want to start? And then maybe I can say 2 words about it.
I have been very interested, and I'm still very interested in these artworks because they don't follow rules. And I'm deeply moved when I discover the new artworks because it is a work of great inventiveness, but at the same time, the creators are rebels. They are resistant. Of course, they protest. It is a silent protest, but it is a protest, and they invent an alternative. Most of them have been traumatized by the war, by the psychiatrist refinement, by an exile, exodus, by the death of a child, I don't know. And they have resisted, and they have invented a new way of expression. They don't have had the right to speak, and so they take it. They take it, and they have an incredible strength, and they have ideas. And it means that all of us, of course, we don't have their creativity, but all of us have artistic capacities, but they are silent most of the time. There are two silence inside. Yeah. And
okay,
your question for you?
Yes, the sort of the legacy of institutional psychotherapy. I mean, it's there isn't so much. Several of the concepts of institutional psychotherapy have been incorporated in regular psychiatry, but I would say that there isn't a movement as such. You know, if anything, psychiatry as a discipline seems to be going more towards biology and towards neurosciences than towards a kind of valorization of the unconscious. But at the same time, I think there are people experimenting with these techniques, you know, sort of younger people who have been reading Lacan, who've been kind of trying to incorporate psychoanalysis and psychiatry. Also people who obviously who have been reading Guattari's writings also, or Jean Houry's writings. Jean Houry's writings are almost not translated in English. It's one of the things I've been talking about with other people trying to make this work accessible to English speakers. But Guattari, of course, has a broader public. We have a lot of questions and only a few minutes left, Lucienne. So I'm going to just try to ask you. Maybe I'll ask you 2 questions, and then you can, or maybe I'll ask 3 questions, and you can try to because we won't have so much time. One of them is, in your long experience dealing with Brut creators, did you notice a gender difference in treating textile and in sewing body garments? Like, is there a kind of gendered aspect here? Which is very interesting. You want to answer this one? Okay.
Yes, it's very interesting because in outsider art, I said they don't have the right to speak. They are marginal people, and actually we can find many women. And these women, yes, sometimes they use and they invent textile, and they create with textile pieces. But as we have just seen with the Scottish Angus McPhee, he was not really creating textile artworks, but he made them with the grass you have seen, and some of them men, yes, were also inventing artworks with the textile, and no, it's not like in professional and cultural quote unquote creation.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one last question. I think I'm going to combine the 2 questions that both get to the kind of definition of art brut, right? Who gets to decide? One person asks, am I correct in thinking that the Dubuffet Foundation reserves the sole right to decide what can and cannot be included under the category of art brut? I mean, there is something it's an interesting question, the kind of paradoxical role of the kind of spontaneous creation you were mentioning, and at the same time, the role of the museum in this, obviously, right? And related to this is another excellent question. which asks, why is it important to refer to art brut as a special category of art production today? And perhaps when representational painting was the primary form of valued art in the Western world, but now that it's no longer the case, what's the need of this category? I mean, in other words, if representational painting is the norm, then art brut makes sense. But if now we're in a stage of, where that's no longer the kind of center, why keep the category art brut?
Yes, it is a fixed designation. It is a category. I think what is really different is the fact that these people are creating without being self-taught artists, being self-taught people, and at the same time, and this is very important, without thinking of a recognition, an approval. So they really work by themselves and for themselves, because they don't need to share, they don't need to communicate. And when we speak about professional or cultural, quote unquote, artists, and they need to share, they need to show, they need to sell. And I understand very well, it is not a judgment value, but when we meet art brut creators, it's very strange. They are really surprised that we are interested in what they do, and they don't have had the idea to share, to show, to sell, and they don't have this in their mind. So I think that the conditions, solitude, secrecy, and silence, the conditions of the creation are really, really different, and the goals are really different too. But I share the idea with great pleasure to organize exhibition with many kind of artworks. But I think that we have to be really informed of the condition of the life and of the context of the artworks, I think. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, we don't.
I know, I wish we had more time to continue. This is fascinating, but unfortunately, I think we're out of time. And Fanny will come and tell us.
I appear to say, we run out of time. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful conversation, very interesting, and I think it's a conversation to be continued. And I would like to deeply thank you, both of you, Lucienne, for joining us from Lausanne today, and Camille under the snow.
Exactly.
And also thank you to all the people who tune in today. And the event is recorded, so if you were not able to see it, you will be able to find it on the Maison Française website and on Facebook. And I wish you a beautiful end of the day, evening, or afternoon. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to you.
Bye, Lucienne.
Thanks to you.